I was lying on the cold kitchen floor when I realized the truth I'd been avoiding for years. Pain shot through my side, but the deeper pain was the sound of my son's footsteps walking right past me, as if I were nothing more than a shadow. He did not look down. He did not ask if I could breathe. He only returned hours later, not to check on me, but to ask for money, as casually as asking for the time. That moment broke something fragile inside me, and it was from that crack that the entire story began. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you have not already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Hannah Morales, and at 67 years old, I have learned that most days begin the same way, quietly, deliberately, with the kind of stillness that settles into your bones after years of learning to live alone. I wake before sunrise, long before the neighborhood stirs, and move through my little bungalow in Tampa, Florida, as if following a choreography written by memory. The old radio on the counter clicks twice before the soft hum of jazz fills the kitchen. The familiar warmth of the sound wraps around me while I brew coffee strong enough to keep me steady through the morning. The house itself is small, but every inch of it carries a story. My husband and I bought it nearly 4 decades ago, back when our hands were young and confident, when we believed we had endless time to fill each room with laughter. His tattered Tap D still hangs by the pantry door. I refuse to wash the last faint trace of cinnamon from its fabric. In the corner sits the heavy mixing bowl he used each weekend when he made pancakes. I run my hand across the rim each morning before I begin my own ritual of baking waffles for the neighbors. It is a habit that keeps my hands busy and my mind steady. My body, on the other hand, has grown less cooperative. My left knee aches when the humidity rises, and the stiffness in my fingers sometimes makes gripping utensils difficult. Still, I push through it. I have never been fond of relying on others, and independence feels like the last treasure I can guard. Eric, my son, does not understand that. He is 35 now, though sometimes his disappointment in life has carved something older into his face. After a failed business attempt 2 years ago, he returned home for a few months to get back on his feet. Months have turned into nearly a year, and the dent he has made in my guest bed has become a permanent hollow. He sleeps late, leaves his shoes wherever they fall, and talks endlessly about the next opportunity that never seems to arrive. I tell myself he only needs time. A mother's faith can be stubborn like that. Yet increasingly, his eyes drift toward my finances, my house, my savings. Sometimes he asks questions in that soft, casual tone people use when pretending not to care. I sense something underneath it, something sharp. Melissa, my daughter, lives all the way in Denver. She calls often, always worried that I'm handling too much alone. She has hinted more than once that Eric is taking advantage of my softness. I brush it off each time, reminding her that family should be patient with one another. I say the words because they sound right, even when I am no longer sure they are true. Outside, the neighborhood is quiet and familiar. Rosa next door tends her garden each morning, waving at me with the soil on her hands. Most of the residents are around my age, drawn by the safety and the slow rhythm of this place. They see me as capable, steady, someone who always has an extra loaf of banana bread cooling on the counter. What they do not see are the thin fractures forming in the peace inside my home. The letters from the bank addressed to me by mistake, or so I told myself. The way Eric has begun speaking about the house as though it belongs to him. the whispers of doubt that cross my mind late at night, only to fade with the morning light. For now, I cling to my routines, pretending everything is steady. But something is shifting beneath the surface, the way the ground sometimes settles before it cracks. If you're still watching, and this moment hit you as hard as it hit me, comment number 1 below so I know you're still here with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. Things are about to shift in ways no one sees coming. The morning the unease settled into my bones began like any other, though the air carried a heavy dampness that made my joints throb before I even stepped out of bed. I moved slowly toward the kitchen, steadying myself against the hallway wall as the stiffness in my left knee protested with each step. When I reached the refrigerator, a small pool of water had formed on the floor. It spread in a thin, shimmering sheet, catching the early light. I stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether it came from condensation or something worse. I bent down with caution, feeling the familiar tug in my hip, and dabbed a corner of a towel into the puddle. The cold traveled up my fingers, leaving a strange prickle that I could not shake. The radio murmured softly behind me, but the kitchen felt unusually hollow. I braced my hands on the countertop before pushing myself upright, the stiffness radiating up my leg. It struck me, uninvited, that if I had slipped in that water, no one would have known. The thought lingered like a shadow against the wall. Eric shuffled into the kitchen much later, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He drifted past me without noticing the towel on the floor or the way I was leaning heavily on the counter. Instead, he scanned the room with an expression I could not decipher. His gaze lingered on the cabinets, the appliances, the aging tiles. When he finally spoke, his tone was light, almost casual, yet it rang oddly in the quiet. "This place is really getting old," he said. "Not exactly the safest setup for someone your age." The words settled uneasily between us. When I asked him what he meant, he shrugged and busied himself with the coffee maker, avoiding my eyes. Something in his manner left me colder than the puddle on the floor. Later, when I checked the mailbox, another envelope from the bank was waiting. My name, my address. The letter inside referenced an ongoing review for a home equity line of credit I had never applied for. I read the paragraph twice, my heartbeat tapping against my ribs. I folded the letter carefully, slid it into the drawer beside the sink, and pressed the drawer shut as if that could silence the rising questions. Melissa called that afternoon. Her face filled the screen, warm, concerned, perceptive in a way that always made me feel both known and exposed. She asked if I was feeling all right, if something was bothering me. I laughed softly, but the sound felt thin. She noticed. She always noticed. When she asked if Eric had mentioned anything about finances, a long hesitation slipped out before I could stop it. She watched me closely, noticing what I did not say. It was the first time I did not dismiss her worry outright. After the call ended, I returned to the kitchen to clean the rest of the water. As I bent down, a sharp pain shot through my knee. My balance wavered, and for a split second the room tilted. I gripped the edge of the counter, my breath rushing out in a tremble. The image of myself lying helplessly on the floor flashed across my mind. The fear in it was raw, startling. Eric left the house shortly after with a vague remark about sorting some things out. His words carried a weight that followed me long after the door shut behind him. The house felt too quiet in his absence, every sound amplified, the tick of the wall clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the echo of my own pulse. That evening, when another bead of water rolled down the front of the refrigerator and splashed exactly where I had nearly fallen, I felt the first real shiver of something approaching, something I had not yet named, but could no longer ignore. If you're still watching and you can sense the storm building, comment number 2 below to let me know you're following every step. Now let's dive into chapter 3, where the first real cracks began to show. The morning I fell began in a quiet, almost deceptive calm. The air hung thick with humidity, the kind that presses against your joints before your mind is fully awake. I moved through the dim hallway toward the kitchen, the familiar shuffle of my slippers brushing against the floor. I did not bother turning on the overhead light. The sun had not risen yet, but I trusted the soft glow from the window above the sink to guide me, the way it always did. I stepped forward, thinking only about the coffee I would brew and the batter I needed to prepare. Instead, my foot slid sharply across the slick tile. There was no time to catch myself. My body twisted, weight shifting violently to my left side. The world tilted, and then the floor rose up in a merciless, solid rush. My hips struck the ground first, followed by my elbow, followed by a brief, stunned silence in my own mind. Pain thundered through me in a bright, blinding wave. I gasped, unable to make sense of where the agony began or where it spread. The cold from the tile seeped immediately into my skin, chilling me from the outside while the pain burned fiercely inside. I tried to roll onto my back, but the movement sent a jagged shock through my leg. My breath caught. I reached out for the counter, for anything, but my fingers met only air. The refrigerator hummed steadily beside me, its low vibration echoing through the floor. I could smell the metallic tang from the old coils mixed with the faint scent of bleach from last night's cleaning. My mind sharpened for a moment with the realization that I could not stand. No matter how I shifted, my leg refused to bear even the slightest command. Footsteps appeared somewhere down the hallway, slow, dragging footsteps that belonged unmistakably to Eric. Relief flickered through me, thin and fragile. I listened as the footsteps came closer, stopping at the threshold of the kitchen. The shadow of his figure stretched across the tiles. He saw me lying there. I know he did. His gaze lingered long enough for me to feel it press against my skin, but there was no urgency in it, no rush of concern, only a long, unreadable pause. He muttered something vague, something about being late, and moved past me toward the living room. I watched from the floor as he grabbed his keys and slid his wallet into his pocket. For a moment, I thought he might return, might crouch down and steady me, might remember that I was his mother lying helpless on the ground. Instead, he stepped around the small puddle on the floor without looking back. The door opened, the door closed. His car engine started, then faded down the street. The ache in my hip deepened, spreading in hot pulses that almost made me sick. I pressed my palms against the floor, dragging myself a few inches, then collapsing again. My breath shook. I tried again, stretching my arm toward the nearest chair, the wood just out of reach. As I shifted my weight, an envelope slid into view from beneath the cabinet. My name was printed neatly across the front. The words, "Confirmation of Home Equity Loan Review," stared back at me, sharp and undeniable. My heart stuttered. This was no clerical error. Something had been started in my name, something I had never approved. And suddenly, Eric's cold eyes and hurried departure made a new kind of sense. I tapped my heel weakly against the cabinet, more out of desperation than strategy. The sound must have carried farther than I expected, because moments later, Rosa's voice drifted through the back door. She called my name once, then again more urgently. When I could not answer, she pushed open the unlocked door and gasped at the sight of me on the floor. She knelt beside me, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. As I lay there waiting for the ambulance, the ceiling above me blurred. The real pain pulsed not in my hip, but in the hollow left by the person who had walked away. If you're still watching and starting to feel the tension rising, drop a number 3 in the comments so I know you're staying with me. Now let's move to Chapter 4, where the struggle starts revealing its true weight. The ambulance ride blurred into a haze of sirens and fluorescent lights. I remember lying on the stretcher with the stiff sheet tucked around me, feeling as if the world had tilted permanently out of alignment. By the time we arrived at the emergency room, my hip throbbed with a deep, pulsing ache that made every breath feel sharp. Nurses lifted me onto a hospital bed, asked questions I struggled to answer, and wheeled me from station to station beneath harsh, unwavering lights. Machines clicked and hummed. X-ray panels glowed white around the edges. Each movement of my leg sent a spike of pain from my hip to my ribs. When the doctor returned, his expression was calm but firm. He explained that I had fractured my hip, not severely enough for immediate surgery, but badly enough to require weeks of rehabilitation. Weeks. The words settled over me like a thick blanket I could not push aside. I lay there in a thin hospital gown, unable to shift without help. Realizing I could not return home anytime soon, a nurse asked whether any family members were on their way. I glanced at my silent phone on the rolling nightstand and felt a hollow spreading through my chest. I tried calling Eric first, because that seemed logical. He had seen me on the floor. He knew something was wrong. The call rang until it cut off. When I tried again, it went to voicemail. Minutes later, a message popped onto the screen, brief and distant. He wrote that he was occupied and to keep him updated. There was no concern, no urgency. It read more like a reminder from an employer than anything a son might send to his injured mother. Rosa arrived instead. She carried a soft scarf and a bottle of water, her eyes warm but worried. Her presence made me both grateful and ashamed. I had lived a long life believing that independence was one of my strengths. Now, I was lying in a hospital bed, being watched over by a neighbor while my own children were absent. I thanked her gently, trying to sound stronger than I felt. She stayed only a short while, long enough to assure me she would check in again soon. Her departure left the room quiet, save for the steady beeping of the monitor beside my bed. I was transferred later that day to Harmony Ridge Rehabilitation Center, a place that smelled of antiseptic and lavender disinfectant. My room was small, but had a window overlooking a patch of garden filled with purple sage. The bed was adjustable, the walls painted a calming beige, and the air felt still, almost suspended. A therapist explained my schedule and the steps required for recovery. Each word emphasized how dependent I would need to become. The admission stung, though I tried not to show it. I attempted to arrange my belongings on the dresser, refusing help at first. When I reached too far, pain shot down my side and forced me back against the mattress. I tried again to swing my legs over the edge of the bed, but my muscles trembled and I had to grip the rail just to stay upright. The truth settled in slowly. I could not manage this alone. My efforts, however determined, were failing before they even began. Eric arrived the next day with the notebook in hand. He did not ask how I was healing or whether the pain had lessened. Instead, he asked about insurance information, about savings accounts, about the cost of treatment. His voice carried no malice, yet there was an unmistakable calculation in it, as if my well-being were a logistical detail rather than a concern. I listened quietly, my suspicions deepening with every word he uttered. Later that evening, Rosa visited again and helped unpack the rest of my bag. As she sorted through my papers, she paused and lifted an envelope I did not recognize. My name appeared on the front beside the emblem of a bank I rarely used. Inside was a copy of a loan document bearing what was supposed to be my signature. The curves and strokes resembled mine, but I knew instantly that I had never touched that page. A chill crawled over my skin. The suspicion that had begun as a whisper now took shape with frightening clarity. When Rosa left and the room quieted, I stared at the ceiling in the dim light. My efforts to restore order, to pretend everything could still be normal, were failing. Something far darker was unfolding beneath the surface, and I sensed that the fracture in my hip was only the beginning. If you're still watching, and this chapter struck a nerve, comment number 4 below, so I know you're still walking beside me. Now let's keep going into chapter 5, where everything begins to unravel. The sky over the rehabilitation center darkened earlier than usual that afternoon, turning the windows into muted mirrors. I had just finished a grueling round of physical therapy, my hip burning as though someone had poured heat into the bone itself. Even after Rosa left, the ache throbbed through me like a slow, unwelcome heartbeat. The air in my room felt thick, almost heavy, as if it knew something was coming and was bracing for the collision. I lay back against the pillows and stared at the envelope on my bedside table, the one with the forged signature that had haunted me for days. The edges were creased from being handled too many times, and every time my gaze landed on it, a fresh wave of betrayal rolled through me. I could not pretend anymore. Not after everything I had pieced together. Not after knowing the signature on a financial withdrawal was not mine, even though it was written in the same looping curve I had used my whole adult life. My fingers shook slightly as I reached out and touched the paper. The truth was simple and devastating. My son had crossed a line I never believed he could cross. I told myself I would confront him the next time he came. I did not expect that moment to arrive so quickly. Eric walked in without knocking, his movement sharp, restless. His jacket zipper clinked as he shifted from one foot to the other, and the scent of stale coffee clung to him. He talked quickly about insurance documents, about needing my identification again, about accounts that supposedly required my confirmation. His words were tight and rehearsed, and his eyes flicked around the room, never fully meeting mine. I watched him, feeling something heavy rise inside my chest. I asked him about the bank envelope. His reaction was small but unmistakable, a split-second freeze in his face, a tightening at the corner of his mouth. He tried to smooth it over with excuses, claiming I might have forgotten that I signed it, suggesting I had been under medication, implying that my memory was slipping. Those words burned worse than the pain in my hip. I felt heat climb up my throat, a mixture of humiliation and fury. The room seemed to tilt as I struggled to stay composed. Images from that morning in my kitchen flashed through me with cruel clarity. Me lying on the floor, unable to move, while Eric stepped past me as though I were an obstacle in his way. The look in his eyes then matched the one in front of me now. Cold, distracted, inconvenienced. Everything clicked into place. This was not forgetfulness. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a pattern, a choice. As he kept talking, his voice rising defensively, his backpack slipped off his shoulder and landed on the chair. The side pocket sagged open just enough for a folder to slide halfway out. My gaze landed on it, and for a breath I could not move. I could read part of the title even from where I lay. It said, Draft Contract for Property Transfer. Owner, Hannah Moore. The sight of my own name on a document that should never exist made my stomach drop. He had planned more than a withdrawal. He had set the stage to sell my house, the home where I had lived, cooked, worked, mourned, and grown older. The weight of that realization stole whatever softness remained in me. My chest tightened until breathing felt like a task I had to remember, step by step. Eric snatched the folder back into the bag when he noticed my eyes on it. His face hardened. Anger flickered in him, not the righteous kind, but the panicked kind, the kind that comes from being caught too close to the truth. He said nothing else. The door slammed behind him with a violent finality, leaving the room trembling in the aftermath. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling the tectonic shift inside my life. This was no longer a crack in our relationship. It was a fracture, a break, a point of no return. The night after Eric stormed out, the rehabilitation center felt colder than usual. Shadows stretched long across the walls, and the steady hum of medical machines blended with the soft shuffle of nurses changing shifts. I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the faint pattern on the ceiling, unable to ignore the weight that pressed against my chest. The pain in my hip pulsed rhythmically, but even that physical ache felt small compared to the heaviness that had settled in my heart. Something had broken inside me, something made of trust, of motherhood, of the belief that my son would never cross a certain line. I replayed every moment of our confrontation again and again, searching for a version that made sense. I remembered the sharp look in his eyes when he realized I had seen the folder in his backpack, the tension that tightened his shoulders, the silence he left behind when he slammed the door. These were not the actions of a desperate man who made a mistake. These were the actions of someone who believed I was no longer a person with boundaries, only an obstacle standing between him and something he wanted. That realization settled into me like cold water. For hours, I lay there, torn between instinct and survival. A mother is supposed to protect, forgive, understand. I had built my life around those beliefs. I had convinced myself that patience was a virtue and endurance was a form of love. But the truth pressed harder with every passing minute. If I did not act now, I would lose everything that allowed me to stand on my own feet. I could feel the echo of the morning I fell in my kitchen, the floor hard beneath me, the silence deafening, and my son walking past without stopping. That memory was no longer a wound, it was a warning. I sat up slowly, breathing through the strain in my hip. The small lamp beside the bed cast a warm glow that barely reached the corners of the room. I reached for my handbag on the chair and began searching for the documents Malcolm had given me months ago. My hands trembled not from pain, but from the awareness that what I did next would change the shape of my life. My fingers brushed against a sealed envelope I did not recognize. The return address belonged to my bank. I opened it carefully. The letter inside confirmed something that made my pulse quicken. It requested final confirmation for a financial transaction, one large enough to jeopardize everything I had worked for. The date on the letter told me exactly how little time I had left. Eric had been inches away from stripping me of my home, my security, the last piece of independence I still possessed. My breath caught in my throat. If I had waited even a week longer, the damage would have been irreversible. That letter erased the last of my hesitation. A kind of clarity settled over me, steady and cold. I had spent decades believing love meant staying quiet, staying soft, staying available. But love, real love, even for myself, sometimes meant drawing the line so firmly that it could not be crossed again. I reached for my phone, ignoring the stab of pain as I shifted my weight. The window reflected a faint streak of dawn rising behind the trees, a thin ribbon of light cutting through the darkness. I dialed Malcolm. When he answered, I did not apologize for waking him. I did not explain everything. I simply told him I was ready to update every document, ready to secure the trust, ready to remove any access Eric had ever gained. As I spoke, I felt something inside me settle into place, a sense of resolve I had not felt in years. When I put the phone down, the room grew still again, but the heaviness in my chest finally loosened. I leaned back, letting the faint morning light brush across the blanket. I knew the days ahead would not be easy. I knew Eric would not accept my decision quietly, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like the ground beneath me belonged to me again. If you're still watching and feeling the pressure of the choices ahead, leave a number 6 in the comments to stay with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7, where the fallout finally arrives. The morning after I signed the documents with Malcolm, the room felt unusually hollow, as if the air had thinned overnight. I woke before the nurses switched shifts, lying still while the faint ache in my hips spread outward in slow pulses. The emotional weight from the day before settled heavier than any physical pain. I had made my choice, and although a quiet determination held me upright, a sadness just as deep pressed into my chest. Decisions, I realized, could be both necessary and devastating at the same time. The hallway lights cast a pale strip under my door as Malcolm entered with a stack of folders tucked beneath his arm. He moved calmly, almost gently, as if he sensed the fragility of my state. He laid out each document with careful precision, explaining that the updated trust would become irrevocable the moment the signatures were complete. He reviewed the removal of any previous permissions Eric might have had and confirmed new safeguards around the house, accounts, and medical directives. I listened carefully, feeling the ground of my life shift with every page I signed. By the end, my hand trembled from strain, but my resolve did not. Malcolm collected the papers, assured me everything would be filed immediately, and reminded me that protecting myself was not an act of betrayal, but survival. Only hours later, the consequences began to ripple outward. My phone lit up with several missed calls in quick succession. I recognized the number instantly, Eric. I did not answer, not out of spite, but because I knew any conversation in that moment would lead to a spiral I no longer had the strength to endure. I watched the screen fade to black, each unanswered ring leaving a bruise of guilt followed by a harder, clearer edge of self-preservation. The silence that followed was both a comfort and a wound. Memories surfaced uninvited. I saw Eric as a toddler running through the sprinkler in our backyard, arms open, face lifted toward the sky. I remembered nights he crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, clutching my hand until he fell asleep. Those images clashed painfully with the reality of the man who had tried to steal from me, the man who planned to dismantle the life his parents built. The contrast left a hollow ache that no amount of reasoning could soothe. Later that afternoon, a nurse stepped inside with a clipboard in hand. She mentioned that someone had called asking about my medical condition, claiming to be an immediate relative seeking updates. When she said Eric's name, something inside me went cold. It was suddenly clear he was searching for a way around the barriers I had put in place. Instead of guilt, a sharper assurance settled in me. If I had hesitated even one day longer, everything might have already slipped out of my control. The rest of the rehab center seemed to carry whispers of its own. A few patients had witnessed the strained visit with Eric the week before, and now watched me with soft, sympathetic eyes. One older woman in a wheelchair shared a quiet story of how her own son had emptied her savings years ago, a story that mirrored my own pain in haunting ways. Their presence did not fix anything, but it reminded me that betrayal was not unique to me. Aging parents were often left carrying wounds no one warned them about. As evening fell, the physical pain in my hip grew sharper, a reminder of the fall that started all of this. I pressed a cold pack against the swollen area. Breathing carefully through each spike of discomfort, my body was slow to heal, and the emotional turmoil did not help. Still, under everything, a strange sense of relief threaded through me. The world had tilted, but I had steadied myself before the ground gave way entirely. When I looked out the window, I saw a bird hop along the iron railing outside, its wings lifting against the fading light. Life continued in small, steady motions. I let the sight settle into me, breathing easier for the first time that day. I knew the path ahead would not be peaceful, but I had stepped into a truth I could finally live with. The consequences were heavy, but so was strength. The morning sky outside the rehabilitation center was a dull sheet of gray, the kind that made the world feel slower and quieter. I woke with a heaviness still settled across my chest, the remnants of the past few days lingering like a bruise beneath the skin. But beneath that weight, something steadier had begun to form, a clarity that had taken root after everything unraveled. I lay still for a few minutes, letting the muted light seep through the blinds while I reminded myself that endurance was no longer enough. I needed to move forward with intention, not fear. When June arrived later that morning, she walked in with a small container of homemade muffins and a thick cardigan folded over her arm. She placed the items on the table with the same gentle care she always had, then sat beside me. I could feel her eyes studying my face, tracing the fatigue etched into my features. Her presence had become a kind of quiet anchor in these past days. When she reached out and touched my hand, I felt a warmth I had almost forgotten, a reminder that kindness could exist without obligation, without expectation. I found myself speaking softly, telling her how hollow it felt to realize that the people I once believed would protect me were instead the ones who had harmed me most. The words did not come out as confession or complaint, but as the truth of a woman who had run out of ways to justify the actions of those she loved. June did not interrupt. She simply listened, offering the comfort of someone who understood what it meant to be disappointed by family. It was in that silence that something shifted in me. I realized I had been clinging to a version of motherhood that no longer served either of us. Blood alone was not enough to define loyalty. Sometimes, family had to be chosen. Later that afternoon, Malcolm returned with the finalized documents. He arranged the stack neatly on the table, going through each page with deliberate clarity. The trust was now fully secured, irreversible without my written consent. All financial access previously linked to Eric had been removed. My home and accounts were protected under layers of legal safeguards. As I scanned the pages, I felt a sense of solidity forming beneath my feet, like I had stepped back onto firm ground after standing too long on a cracking surface. Malcolm then handed me a smaller envelope. It was from the bank, informing me that another attempt had been made to access my accounts, but had been blocked by the new security measures. The letter should have frightened me, but instead it delivered a strange kind of reassurance. It proved that every step I had taken was not only necessary but timely. Waiting longer would have been a mistake I could never undo. After Malcolm left, I pulled out a notepad and began writing a list of everything I needed to do once I returned home. Replace the locks, rearrange the living room so I could move more easily, contact the utility companies, review all remaining documents. This time, the list was not a burden. It was a blueprint for a life no longer shaped by fear of what Eric might do. It was the first list I had written in years that revolved solely around what I needed. By evening, the clouds began to part, letting thin beams of sunlight spill across the linoleum floor of my room. I stood with my hands resting on the windowsill, watching the light stretch across the courtyard. It was faint, but it was there. A small, steady promise that a new beginning did not require permission, only courage. If you're still watching and sensing the story reaching its turning point, comment number 8 below, so I know you're with me until the end. Now let's move into the conclusion, where everything finally comes into focus. The morning I left the rehabilitation center felt strangely still, as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge the shift taking place in my life. A thin layer of cold mist clung to the car windows as June helped me settle into the passenger seat, adjusting the seatbelt and placing my small bag at my feet. My steps were slow but steadier than before, and although my body remained tender, there was something firmer beneath my ribs. Leaving the center meant stepping back into a life I no longer recognized, but for the first time, it was a life I was prepared to face. When we pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered, quieter, and somehow older. June unlocked the door, holding it open while I crossed the threshold. The air inside was still, untouched for weeks, carrying the faint scent of dust and wooden floors. It did not greet me with warmth, but it did not threaten me either. It was simply mine. June opened a few windows to let in the pale morning light, then moved around the living room, brushing away dust and straightening cushions. I watched her with gratitude settling deep inside me. She asked nothing of me, expected nothing, yet always showed up. The absence of Eric was immediate and heavy, a kind of silence that used to make my heart ache. But as I moved through each room, I felt something shift. The space that once felt hollow now seemed open, free. I collected a few of his forgotten belongings and placed them on the hallway shelf, not out of sentiment, but as a quiet marker of closure. His presence no longer defined this home. Later, when I checked the mailbox, I found a thick envelope from Malcolm containing every finalized document. I sat at the kitchen table and opened it carefully. Page after page confirmed what he had promised. The trust amount secured, my property protected, every loophole sealed. For the first time in years, I felt untouchable. No one could take what was mine. In the late afternoon, the doorbell rang. Eric stood on the porch, tense and impatient. I opened the door but did not step aside. The threshold between us felt like a boundary drawn in stone. His questions came quickly, sharp and demanding, but I offered only calm, steady answers. I handed him a sealed envelope containing the legal decisions. Whatever reaction he searched for in my face, he did not find it. When his frustration finally burned out, he walked away with nothing left to claim. I closed the door gently behind him. Instead of trembling, I exhaled. The silence that followed wrapped around me like a beginning, rather than an end. That evening, June returned with a warm meal and a soft smile, filling the house with a sense of comfort I had long forgotten. When she left, I sat alone in my living room, watching the glow from the lamp spread across the walls. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had come home to myself. The days have taken on a quieter rhythm, one that settles gently into the walls of my home. I wake to the soft glow filtering through the curtains, move slowly through rooms that once felt hollow, but now feel simply mine. The wooden counter in the kitchen no longer reminds me of the night I collapsed beside it. Instead, it feels like a surface I reclaimed, one I touch each morning. When I steady myself to make coffee, there is calm in the routine, and I no longer search for anyone's footsteps but my own. I have begun to look back without trembling. From the fall in the kitchen to the long stretch of silence from my children, the path feels impossibly long, yet it has shaped me in ways I never expected. I understand now that losing their approval was never the true loss. The real wound was believing I needed it. What remained after everything, the trust, the house, my own sense of worth, was worth guarding. June's presence taught me that care is an action, not a title. She arrived when I whispered for help, and she stayed long after the crisis ended. Choosing her as the guardian of what I leave behind was not an act of revenge. It was an acknowledgement of truth. Kindness deserves a place to land. If there is anything I carry forward, it is this. Betrayal may break something, but it also clears space. You decide what grows there next. This morning, I heard June's car outside. I opened the door before she could knock, the sunlight at her back, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the future waiting. In the end, life has a way of stripping away everything that was never meant to last and revealing what truly matters. Sometimes it is only after the fall, literal or otherwise, that we begin to understand the quiet strength we carry, the boundaries we must draw, and the peace that waits on the other side of letting go. Healing is rarely loud. It arrives in ordinary mornings, in steadier breaths, in the soft acceptance that self-worth does not depend on who fails to show up. What remains after disappointment can become the foundation for a gentler, wiser chapter, one built on self-respect, clarity, and the courage to protect what is ours. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it moved you, even a little, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment, follow, and subscribe so we can keep sharing more stories together.